It was here somewhere, Borondrin muttered. I swear it was here somewhere. Somewhere, Mazgila replied with distaste. My milk was somewhere too. Apparently. You'd be better off hunting mice. Borondrin sneezed as the dust covering the books rose into the air and irritated his nose. I'm allergic to dust, he added despairingly. Allergies. They always have allergies, Mazgila said, without specifying who he was talking about or to whom. Where's my damn milk? Borondrin sneezed again, wobbled, almost fell off the stool, but managed to keep his balance. He cursed under his breath. Wizards! Mazgila said with contempt. Utterly incompetent in life. Borondrin looked at him with such an expression that the cat, after a moment's thought, darted into a corner and hid behind a bookshelf. I'll go hunt those mice, Mazgila said placatingly. Go wherever you want. Borondrin growled. I'll never find this book, he sneezed again and wiped his nose with his sleeve, and I'm already sick. He looked up at the books tightly packed on the shelves and sighed. This was just one library room. And he had 11 of them. 11 rooms full of books, from floor to ceiling. And he had no idea where anything was. I really need to clean up and organize, he declared firmly. I've been hearing that for 6 years, Mazgila scoffed from the corner. The wizard sighed heavily. He briefly considered using the help of demons again, but the last time they organized his books, it ended in argument, shouts, and a brawl. Demons were absolutely incapable of working together. Besides, Borondrin was convinced they had brazenly stolen from him. He sighed again, and that's when he noticed the crystal ball glowing with a bright blue light. He approached the table. Yes, he said. Greetings. On the surface of the ball slowly appeared a face of Master Arivald. A longtime friend and a famous wizard. What's up? Arivald asked. Not good, Borondrin complained. I can't find Medlock. And what's a Medlock? Arivald's voice sounded hoarse, but the ball always distorted tones. Necromanticon, by Medlock, Borondrin explained. It's a book. Yes, now I remember. Why do you need a Necromanticon? It's a pile of nonsense. And besides, if I remember correctly, the Grandmaster forbade keeping it in private collections. Don't be such a legalist, Borondrin muttered. I'm preparing an experiment. Hearing that from you is alarming. Arivald must have been truly concerned because the ball, sensitive to mood changes, began to glow pink. Now that's offensive. Borondrin felt a tickle in his nose again and sneezed once more. Allergies? Arivald asked sympathetically. I've been feeling achy since yesterday. Yes, and I suppose you can only break one horseshoe at a time now instead of two, Borondrin grumbled, loudly blowing his nose into a handkerchief. Arivald laughed and the sound was terrifying. The ball distorted the sound horribly, and Borondrin thought it was high time to recalibrate it to align better with the aura. What's new in Silmanian? He asked. Nothing interesting. Boring as usual. Would you like to go on a little trip? No, Borondrin replied firmly, recalling how once he had been tempted by Arivald to go on a small trip and only returned home 2 years later. And those 2 years he remembered as the worst ever. I need to find that damn book. So boring, Arivald sighed. Well, see you later. Wait. A thought suddenly struck Borondrin. Maybe you could come over and help me clean up? The ball was silent for a long moment. I'm in Silmanian, Arivald replied indulgently. Do you know where Silmanian is? Borondrin considered it a stupid question and didn't bother to answer. Silmanian is almost 600 kilometers from your house. That's nearly 3 weeks' journey. And you're suggesting I come over to help you clean up? Have you lost your mind? Mazgila snickered from his corner. Fine, then, Borondrin said, offended. I should have learned by now that when a man is in need, he can only rely on himself. The ball let out a hoarse laugh. You've always had a tendency to martyr yourself. Even with your hypochondriac allergies. Hypochondriac allergies? Borandrin was taken aback. I'm suffering. Sure. Remember our little trip? Somehow, you didn't have allergies then. Borandrin thought for a moment. He really didn't have allergies back then, but he did have boils, chafing, the beginnings of hemorrhoids, suffered from Belgornian fever, caught creeping lichenworm, and spent the whole 2 years battling lice. Not to mention the chronic flu and rheumatism. The allergies had probably fled in terror. Never in my life, he said, emphasizing each word, will I let you talk me into another journey. I want to live here, and I'd be the happiest man in the world if only I had some order. If you want, I can ask Balbos to send you a few young librarians. They'll clean up the place before you even notice. No. Borandrin shouted, frightened. Don't do that. And why not? Arivald suddenly stopped. Ah, I see, he said after a moment of silence. I warn you, Borandrin, remember what happened to Velvelvenal. I'm not dabbling in necromancy, Borandrin snapped. I'm conducting serious scientific experiments. Borandrin, I'm your friend, but be careful. The ball dimmed. Do you want to have your wand broken? Borandrin shuddered at the thought of such a punishment. I'm really not doing anything wrong, he whispered. Believe me, Arivald, I'm just reading and experimenting a little. Please, don't report me to Harbulera. I'll come to see you, Arivald said. It's been too long since we last met, my friend. Are you sure about this? Grandmaster Harbulera asked. Arivald took a sip of wine and reached for an apple. You can't be sure of anything, he replied. Ah, if only Velvelvenal were here. He would know best what's going on. The Gorga's orb is not sensitive enough and introduces many distortions. It can also significantly disrupt the aura. But what I saw concerned me. So you think that? Grandmaster carefully weighed his words, that Borandrin might have gone astray? This is a private conversation, isn't it? Arivald wanted to make sure. The Grandmaster sighed. Yes, he replied after a moment of hesitation. Then I'll tell you, I'm almost certain. He started to play around with something dangerous. But he hasn't changed so far. Imagine, he complained that he couldn't find Medlocks and Necromantic on the dot. Arivald laughed involuntarily. If he were on the other side, he'd already know how to mask himself. Besides, he still has allergies and grumbles as he always did. However, I think it would be a good idea to visit him. I wouldn't be worried if it were Galadrin or anyone else, but Borandrin. You know well that he's a brilliant theoretician, but he's always had terrible accidents with experiments. All it takes is for him to neglect something, forget something, and disaster is ready to strike. And he'll be too afraid to admit he's in trouble. Borandrin, the old weirdo. The Grandmaster reached for his goblet and wetted his lips. Well, go see him. He fell silent for a moment. I'll grant you proper authority. That won't be necessary, Arivald hastily replied. Borandrin is a good man. Each of us is a good man, and each of us faces a choice at some point in our life. Some can turn back halfway. Both thought of Velvelvenal. And some cannot. Borandrin is so naive that he won't even know when he's gone too far, Arivald said quietly. But I won't be able to punish him. Send someone else. Harbulera shook his head. You're his friend, and it is your duty. And part of that friendship is also carrying out the sentence, if it becomes necessary. It's better for him to lose his power than to end up on the other side. Arivald shrugged. I hope this whole discussion is unnecessary. After all, it's you who's come to me, the Grandmaster noted, somewhat indelicately. I don't know what to think anymore, Arivald shrugged again. I perceived him so strangely. And why specifically the Necromanticon? Harbulera selected a plump peach from the platter and began peeling it with a silver knife. Have you read Medlock yourself? Once, a long time ago. It's a terribly boring treatise and contains a lot of errors. It depends on the version. What? Copists intentionally introduce certain errors. But if Borondrin has an older copy? Borondrin has the original, Arivald said slowly. Now that I think about it, he has several rare volumes, and I think Medlock is among them. Yes, I'm almost sure he has the original. Damn it all! Then the sooner you leave, the better, Harbulera concluded. Borondrin with the original Medlock is a disaster waiting to happen. Arivald nodded grimly. If it occurs to him to start replicating Medlock's experiments, given his absent-mindedness, he'll bring serious trouble upon himself, Harbulera finished. What a time we live in! I can understand students, young magisters. They're always drawn where they shouldn't go. But Borondrin. Arivald stood up. Oh, one more thing, Harbulera stopped him. Have you changed your mind about the orb? No. I'm almost certain that trying to retune it to someone else would destroy it. I'm sorry, but there are only 2 such orbs in the world. I can't take that risk. Fair enough, said the Grandmaster, who had expected that answer anyway. Take care of yourself. I will try. Arivald opened the door. It will be good to leave Silmanian for a while. I really feel like going on a little trip again. It won't hurt anyone to stretch their legs a bit. Just don't stretch them for too long, Harbulera warned, knowing Arivald's penchant for disappearing for months or even years. Arivald had visited Borondrin several times before, but every time he rode out from the forest onto the Owl's Glade, he couldn't help but sigh. Borondrin's house was something truly unique, unparalleled, and one of a kind in the world. Describing the style in which it was built posed some difficulty, as it featured both columns adorned with cherubs with puffed-up cheeks and a steep, mountainous roof, as well as a tower with narrow arrow-slit windows and a dome covered in gold-plated sheets. The gold plating was an illusion, but a hellishly well-casted illusion. The architect who designed this building must have been either drunk or insane. And whoever approved those plans must have matched him step for step in drunkenness or madness. Borondrin had acquired this astonishing house in a rather roundabout way. He had simply won it in a dice game during his younger years. It was said that the game wasn't the most honest, and it was rare for 2 6s to lose, but Borondrin insisted that he had rolled a perfectly legitimate 13. It was dangerous to doubt him on that point, as he was extremely sensitive about it. The house was essentially empty, as Borondrin lived alone with his books only, and although the books were indeed many, in order to fill the interior, there would have to be several times more still. Arivald was descending from the hill, looking at the house with admiration and fascination. The sun was just setting, casting a rosy glow on the gilded dome. In this light, the house looked even stranger than usual. Suddenly, a cat darted out from under his horse's hooves, a large black tomcat with glowing green eyes. Arivald's horse shied and danced on the spot. The wizard pulled the reins tight. "Who are you?" or the tomcat hissed. "The one who will turn you into a fur coat," Arivald replied angrily. "Huh? As if." The cat wasn't intimidated by the threat. "You must be that wizard. 2 wizards at the same time I can't handle. I'll have to leave my childhood home." Mazgila sat down and rubbed his eyes with a paw. "Can you at least create some milk?" "I can," Arivald said, now both curious and amused by the cat. "Good," Mazgila sighed, "because that one," he waved a paw toward the house, "always messes it up. It usually gets the goat's milk. Tell me, can a respectable cat drink goat's milk?" "No, it can't," Arivald laughed. "Exactly. And then he makes me hunt mice. And he wonders why I don't want to eat them. I only like meat fried in fresh fat. Veal, preferably. Although I won't refuse fish either. Ah, it's a dog's life. So, how about that milk?" The wizard muttered something quietly to himself, made a quick motion with his right hand, and the tips of his fingers glowed pink. "Thanks," said the cat, licking its lips as it saw a bowl full of milk. "Oh, by the way, my name is Mazgila." "Actually, Mr. Mazgila, but given the circumstances," he glanced again at the bowl, "I think we are past formalities." Arivald spurred his horse because he had just seen Borondrin stepping out onto the porch. "Enjoy," he called out to the cat as a farewell, but Mazgila didn't hear him, as he was drinking noisily and messily, not at all like a cat. Borandrin had already noticed Arivald and was steadily making his way toward him. "Welcome," he shouted. "I didn't expect you so soon." Arivald dismounted, and they embraced. "I caught a ship to Karangist, and then it all went smoothly," Arivald explained. "What's that animal?" "Masgula," Borandrin laughed. "A bit of a rascal. He showed up as a little kitten, and I've worked on him a bit." "How old is he?" "6, Borandrin said proudly. "Can you imagine?" Arivald shook his head, astonished. "Borandrin, you're incredible. I need to see the spells." "Sure, we'll have time for everything." The wizard had every right to be amazed. The Kepha's law stated that no animal given a human personality could live more than 2 or 3 months after the end of the experiment. This law had been challenged for years, but only in theoretical works. No one had ever managed to achieve practical results. "And you all said I was a poor practitioner," Borandrin reminded Arivald. "Me, a poor practitioner? Unbelievers!" He paused for a moment and tapped Arivald's chest with his finger. "And you'll be even more amazed. I'm working on something that will revolutionize agriculture." "I'm not sure I'm ready for a revolution," Arivald replied cautiously. "Oh? And what would you say to crops as tall as trees, apples the size of watermelons, or berries as big as fists?" "I, Borandrin, will solve the world's food problems." Yes, Mizrin said the same thing. Except that the grain had no ears, the watermelons tasted like ground oak bark, and the berries resembled iron balls. "I hear they were even used as ship ballast in Aga. So they did serve a purpose, after all." "Mizrin?" Borandrin scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Ah, the one with the arrow and the hair." "Exactly. He proved that there's no way an arrow can reach its target. It's just a shame it didn't hold up in practice. We'd have fewer wars." "He met a tragic end, didn't he?" Borandrin said, frowning. "Probably ate one of his own watermelons." No, there was some accident with a bow." "Well, never mind. I won't be discouraged. The life of prophets is always difficult." Borandrin looked up at the sky. "But we are the ones who lay the foundations for a new world." "True, but I'm quite content with the world as it is." "All right, I'll take the fat tie to the stable, and you get something to eat ready. I've had enough of stale rolls and smoked cheese. Veal cutlets in onion sauce, dumplings, and an omelette with apple marmalade would be perfect." "I knew it!" Borandrin exclaimed. "You're always the same. Everything's already prepared. And supposedly you didn't expect me so soon." Arivald shook his head. When they finished eating, Arivald settled into the armchair and carefully packed his pipe. "You should become a master chef," he said. "You'd be the best in the world. Harbula as cook can't compare to you." Borandrin blushed with pride. "I think so too," he said, with no false modesty. "Not like those meals at Damsel's place, right?" "Damn vegetarian," Arivald said, taking a deep drag from his pipe, even though many found it surprising that he smoked by inhaling deeply. "Did you know he even converted his wife? And she seemed like such a sensible girl. I visited them last year for dinner. Well, I was supposed to stay longer, but..." He waved his hand dismissively. "Anne?" Borandrin prompted, intrigued. "Wheat sprout soup, mushroom cutlets with oat pancakes, and for dessert, carrot jelly with ginger beer." "You didn't throw up?" "No," Arivald said with pride, "but it was a close call. Right after, I went to a tavern on the road to Pevel and ordered the biggest pork knuckle of my life. A whole bowl of pickles, a jug of beer, and a bottle of dwarven spirit. I felt better immediately. If you're ever near Pevel, drop by. It's a great tavern, I'm telling you." Borandrin nodded. "You should settle down," he said. "Always on the move. And how is our lovely Leilana?" "She had a boy," Arivald said with such pride as if he were the father himself, "but she's as unbearable as ever. I promised I'd be on the coast for the name-giving. You should come with me. You know how much she likes you." Borandrin sighed. He enjoyed hearing that someone appreciated him. "I can't," he said with regret. "You know, work. We wizards, or at least some of us," he gave Arivald a sidelong glance, "can't give in to our whims. We work for the world and for the greater good. For spiritual development." Speaking of spirits, Arivald reached into his coat. "Want some?" "What's that?" Borondrin eyed the silver flask suspiciously. "Dwarven spirit." "You know I have ulcers," Borondrin grimaced. "Alcohol is bad for me. But I can offer you some flaxseed." "Get out of here with your flaxseed." Arivald snapped, taking a hefty swig and feeling a delightful warmth spread through his body. "Another Galadrin wannabe." Borondrin took offense. "Wizards have delicate bodies and powerful minds," he said, "and you're the opposite. And that's just fine. I'd rather that than constantly whining about being in pain." "I don't whine." You do," Mazgilla snorted from under the table. "I can't listen to it anymore. Ulcers, rheumatism, allergies, poor eyesight, belching, nausea, sore throat, something else always hurts. A curse. Make him hunt mice. He'll recover in no time." Borondrin shrugged off the cat's tirade. "Shall we start cleaning tomorrow?" he asked. "Why not?" Arivald, after a good meal, was inclined to grant the whole world its wishes. "You didn't tell Harbulera anything?" Borondrin lowered his voice. "No," Arivald lied, "and I hope there'll be nothing to tell. You'll see for yourself." "How could you stop trusting me?" he asked, a hint of sadness in his voice. "Do I look like a necromancer?" Arivald patted him on the shoulder. "You look like a perfectly decent old man," he said with a smile, but he could only find out who Borondrin had become within the next few days. "It's 5 a.m. Borondrin said, his voice filled with horror as he rubbed his eyes. "If we start now, then we start now," Arivald replied. "Make breakfast, and let's get to work." Mazgilla, who had somehow managed to shake off his sleepiness, laughed hoarsely. Borondrin threw a slipper at him and missed. The cat deftly dodged and bristled his whiskers. "I never, ever," Borondrin emphasized, "get up before 10. There's always time to change bad habits," Arivald remarked cheerfully. "You'll sleep your life away. This is simply unbelievable cruelty." Borondrin tried to snuggle back into his pillow, but Arivald yanked it out from under his head. "Fine," he said, "let's say I prepare breakfast." "Oh no," the wizard sat on the bed, "I'd rather get up. Otherwise, I'll end up with heartburn again. Remember that soup, in that place?" He snapped his fingers, trying to recall. "The Shaven Forest?" "Exactly. It was an excellent soup," Arivald said, slightly offended. Borondrin said nothing, just sighed heavily. The soup had been cooked with dwarven spirit, and he had heartburn for days afterward, and he burped up the taste of vodka for a good week. "I almost died that time," he bitterly reminded him. "Who told you to provoke the Striegers?" Arivald asked. "And anyway, I still don't believe you'd pronounce the second Gottels on the first try." "I only messed it up because I kept burping," Borondrin shouted. God," he added after a moment, "I can't afford to get upset." He placed his right hand on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, while with his left, he checked the pulse in his right wrist. "What kind of a devil tempted me to invite you here? Stop whining and get up," Arivald returned to the point. "I'm not planning to spend my whole life here. For breakfast, how about some beet soup, meat-filled pastries, stuffed pike, partridges in eggplants, and some dessert? Maybe some berry jelly and meringues with cream?" Borondrin buried his face in his hands. "Or maybe you could just go back," he asked, with little hope in his voice. Arivald gave him a pat on the back, so strong that one could hear a thud. "Let's get to work, old man." "The meringues strike me as not quite crispy enough," Arivald remarked, shaking his head in dissatisfaction. "Next time, you'll need to put in more effort." "Well said, not crispy enough," agreed Mazgilla from under the table, who had also been given a meringue. Borondrin didn't respond, only sighed heavily, wondering what madness had possessed him to invite Arivald. But the jelly isn't bad, the guest praised, though perhaps a bit short on berries. He tasted it again. Yes, definitely not enough berries, but it's passable. Borondrin couldn't take it anymore and slammed his fist on the table, making the dishes jump. One more word, he hissed, and our friendship will be just a memory. Arivald wiped his mouth with a napkin and stood up from the table. Clean up here, and I'll wait in the library. But hurry up. Although nearly all the rooms in Borondrin's house were filled with books, only one bore the noble name of the library. Arivald entered and groaned. Not bad, meow? Mazgila meowed from beneath his feet. I've never seen anything like this in my life, Arivald said. Where should we even start? No difference, reasonably remarked Mazgila. True enough, the wizard sighed, carefully squeezing between two wobbly stacks of books, which swayed even more precariously. Is it like this everywhere? Everywhere? Mazgila snorted. The library is his pride and joy, and here, it's considered ordered. Ah, I see, the wizard rubbed his temples, feeling an incoming headache. Evening arrived with the infernal wail of a soul tormented over the desolation of its existence. Thus, in the words of a fashionable writer, Arivald could summarize the first day of cleaning Borondrin's house. In the library, they found, in addition to magical books and dust, a plethora of unnecessary items, several mousetraps missing springs, some mag-pornographic magazines. Borondrin blushed and muttered that he had no idea how they could have gotten there. The first 35 volumes of Andreas Puffer's 100-volume series titled Dwarven Milk, several pairs of shoes in various sizes, including one pair enchanted with a smartly encoded burning spell, a few kilograms of Borondrin's manuscripts. He spent half the day reading them, marveling at the depth of the author's mind, a full suit of plate armor with rusted greaves, nearly a dozen engravings depicting deer against sunset backgrounds, 2 bottles of sour wine, and countless other odds and ends, including a 1.5-meter silver-plated picture frame. Arivald tried to stay calm. He also tried to be patient and not curse too much, especially since Borondrin kept complaining about his dust allergy. After a day's work, the library looked as though a mentally deranged typhoon had swept through it, but all the unnecessary items had been thrown out into the yard, where they had piled up into a considerable heap, and the floors had been scrubbed with a rice brush. Borondrin had imbued it with a cheerful soul of a submissive nature for the duration of the cleaning. All that remained was to sort and organize the volumes, but Borondrin and Arivald agreed to leave that task for the next day. I've made some life mistakes, but deciding to visit you was one of the more serious ones, Arivald said, shaking off the dust and noticing how little effect the shaking had. How can you turn a house into such a mess? You need a wife. Someone with a strong will and a firm character. Oh God, no! Borondrin exclaimed. And don't you dare try anything, he added quickly, suddenly suspicious. I know how Galadrin ended up, all because of you. Arivald shrugged. Everyone is the architect of their own fortune, he said sententiously. Then he looked at the library with some pride. Look, here are the fruits of hard work and dedication. Borondrin just grimaced. Now let's go eat something, Arivald said. I see no reason why we can't repeat yesterday's menu. Just hurry up, I'm quite hungry. As they sat down for dessert, Arivald decided it was time to probe Borondrin a bit. What exactly are you working on? He asked. As I said, Borondrin replied with his mouth full, I'm working on issues related to the broadest understanding of agricultural culture. Cut the babble, Arivald warned. What specifically? Increasing crop yields and altering the structure of plants. Solving the world's food shortages. Bigger harvests of larger grains, vegetables, and fruits. At least I'm doing something tangible, unlike you lot in Silmanian. Nature doesn't like interference, Arivald remarked. Will you show me the results? Why not? But I'm still in the preliminary, experimental stages. This is the beginning of great changes, Arivald, Borondrin said with enthusiasm. Magic used on a mass scale. Controlling nature. Changing the course of rivers. Transforming deserts into fertile fields. We can achieve all this by changing our way of thinking about nature. That reeks of Regardius as heresy, Arivald interrupted, frowning. Regardius was a fool, Borondrin snorted. He thought in a vague and fragmentary way. He got lost in murky and barren musings instead of acting. He tried to put some of his ideas into practice, Arivald said, and he was not only sunk in thoughts, since, if I remember correctly, Imsa Valley also sunk when he was trying to change the course of a river. The Brotherhood made significant diplomatic efforts to prevent our outposts from being banned in Pesterhard, which Regardius turned into his experimental playground. Mistakes happen, Borondrin shrugged, but in my case, the likelihood of them occurring is almost nil. Krulg says, he suddenly stopped. Krulg? Arivald repeated gently. Who is that? He felt he was nearing the heart of the matter, and a slight unease crept over him. Borondrin hesitated. I talk too much, he muttered, dissatisfied. Well, he sighed. That orb, Arivald. The one you and I both have. The Gorga's orb, Arivald said. Yes, that's it. I discovered that it can be used not just for communication between us two, who are attuned to them. Through systematic research, I found another use. It helps me connect with someone called Krulg, who probably exists in a world similar to ours, but separated by some barrier or located in a slightly different reality. Arivald cleared his throat, unsure what to make of this. I'd like to speak with him too. Other dimensions, other realities, other astral planes have never been thoroughly studied, and you know well that we're generally advised against delving into these matters. Conservatism. Borondrin growled, poking Arivald in the chest with his finger. It's high time to change that deplorable state of affairs. We can gain extraordinary knowledge and abilities by communicating with other dimensions. As long as we're not communicating with the dead, Arivald said slowly. Nonsense. Borondrin waved his hands dismissively. Don't you think I would recognize the world of the dead? It's one of the fundamental lessons at the Academy, how not to be deceived and not to fall into accidental necromancy. Krulg is alive, just like you or me, only in another world. I admit he looks quite unusual, but he certainly doesn't resemble either the dead or the undead. He's a being of flesh and blood. I want to talk to him, Arivald said firmly. Why did he insist that you keep your acquaintance with him a secret? For this very reason, Borondrin shrugged, so that some overly sensitive wizard wouldn't start to pick holes in everything. I'm trying to pick holes in anything, Borondrin. I'm afraid I can only hope to find anything at all among the holes. Are you trying to insult me? Borondrin clenched his jaw. Remember, this is my house, my experiments, and it's only my business what I do here. Oh, shut up, Arivald said quietly but firmly. Everything we do is the Brotherhood's business, and we are accountable to it in all matters. Have you forgotten that? Or perhaps? The Brotherhood, yes, Borondrin interrupted, but not some smart-ass wizard who sticks his nose where it doesn't belong. And now, Arivald. Arivald pulled out the parchment with the Harbulera's authorization. Borondrin glanced at it and cursed. Intrigues, as usual, digging pits under those who don't follow the herd like sheep. How humiliating! If you don't explain yourself to me, I'll have to take you to Silmanian. Along with the Gorga's orb, Arivald said. I'm sorry, but you've brought this on yourself. To take me? Borondrin smiled maliciously but then suddenly waved his hand. I don't have anything to hide. I'll show you everything, ask whatever you want, and then leave me alone to work in peace. What a mob! He pounded his fist on the table. And I thought you were a friend. I am your friend, and that's why I came to help you. No one wants you to get yourself into trouble. Tonight, Borondrin interrupted again. The orb has the best resonance between 10 in the evening and 2 a.m. Come to my study, and I'll show you everything. Then you can give the Grandmaster a full report. And maybe you'll finally leave me be. He stood up, loudly scraping the chair, and left without even bothering to look at Arivald. Nervous, isn't he? Mazgilla meowed from under the table. Arivald conjured him a bowl of cream. Happens, Arivald said. I saw him, Mazgila boasted, smacking his lips loudly. So who? Arivald asked absent-mindedly, preoccupied with his own thoughts. The one in the orb. Oh. Arivald leaned to the cat. And? In my opinion, gross, Mazgila replied. But I didn't understand anything, they were speaking some strange language. His voice was gross too. We'll see tonight. Arivald helped himself to another meringue. Want one? He asked the cat under the table. Of course, Mazgila said. Stick around for a bit longer, he added. Finally, he's making decent food, but before, he waved a paw dismissively. He even tried to feed me hardtack. Disgusting. Can a cat eat hardtack? Do I look like a sailor? And as for cleaning, well, that's gone to the dogs. He changed the subject. He picked a fight with you on purpose just to avoid working today. He'll lock himself in his room and pretend to be sulking. That's just how he is. I don't think so. Don't think what? Mazgila wiped his whiskers clean with a quick paw movement. That is pretending. I think he's genuinely angry. Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe I just love you so, Mazgila sang hoarsely, then laughed just as harshly. I think I'll take a nap. Things might get interesting tonight. Yes, Arivald muttered to himself as the cat wandered off. Tonight will certainly be interesting. But what will I do if this Krog turns out to be dead? Or worse, undead? Will I have the strength to stand against both of them? He had a very critical view of his own magical abilities, even though now he knew much more than when he first arrived in Silmanian. It seemed miraculous that no one in the secret brotherhood had realized that Arivald's magical skills were below even the most mediocre of students. But so far, on his side was luck, a fortunate set of circumstances, coincidence, call it what you will. Besides, he truly did possess great power. Yet he still lacked the theoretical and practical skills. He spent the time until evening reviewing the sequences of spells used to combat beings from the other world, and with regret, he had to admit that he remembered very little. He searched Borandrin's library for the proper formulas as well, but finding anything useful there was a challenge. Just to be safe, he put on the cross-circle talisman, which perhaps protected against the undead as effectively as a shield against a ballista missile, but at least offered some reassurance. Finally, as evening came, the wizard knocked on the door of Borandrin's study. Come in, Borandrin's voice called encouragingly, and Arivald turned the handle. Borandrin, dressed in his formal attire, a blue cloak with silver stars and a wide-brimmed hat, sat before the Gorga's orb. Sit, he said, not too politely, and behave yourself. I don't know how Krog will react to your presence. Arivald sat and looked at Borandrin critically. You haven't ironed your cloak in a while, have you? He asked. Elegance was never your strong suit. It was only then that he noticed the green eyes gleaming from under the bed. Mazgila must have snuck in unnoticed with him. All right, enough, Borandrin grumbled impatiently. Let's begin. He covered the orb with his hands and began to mutter some incantations that Arivald couldn't decipher. The orb gradually started glowing with a red light. Then Borandrin removed his hands and performed a series of completely incomprehensible gestures with his wand, continuing to mutter. Suddenly, the orb flashed blindingly. Who summons the great Krog? Boomed a deep, bass voice speaking in an ancient and forgotten language, one that Arivald happened to know by chance, having once shared a cell with a professor of ancient linguistics and learned various dialects out of boredom. Who dares disturb the peace of he who rules the essence of all things? Characterized by exceptional modesty, I see, Arivald muttered quietly. But not quietly enough, as Borandrin shot him a reproachful, scolding look. It is I, O mighty and all-knowing Krog, Borandrin said humbly, giving Arivald a sign to stay silent. Ah, Borandrin, the little wizard with the sniffles. Are you here to beg the great Krog for power and knowledge? Oh yes, mighty Krog. The orb revealed a face. It somewhat resembled a human face, but one with skin flayed, exposing raw flesh. It also had very prominent cheekbones and, oddly, an empty eye socket in the middle of its forehead. And who's that with the enormous nose? I told you not to bring anyone. Krulg roared. Arivald stood up. As usual, when things got serious, he remained calm and collected. "Better tell me who you are, you freak," he said. Krulg stared at Arivald for a moment. Arivald even felt as though the empty socket on Krulg's forehead was also looking at him. "You've insulted the great Krulg. The punishment that awaits you will be so terrifying, so dreadful that—" "Enough," Arivald ordered firmly. "Behave yourself like a civilized being, though given your appearance, that might be difficult. I'm a representative of the secret brotherhood in Silmanian, an emissary of the Grandmaster and the Wizards' Council. I suggest you be polite and explain why you've been meddling with this poor fellow's mind," he said, pointing at Borandrin, who was slumped in his seat, clearly broken by the progress of the conversation. Krulg cleared his throat after a moment. "You two probably look as repulsive to me as I do to you. It's very rude to criticize someone's appearance." "And who said I have an enormous nose?" Arivald asked accusatorily. "And who called me a freak?" Krulg fired back immediately. "In my land, I'm considered exceptionally handsome, yet here I am faced with such insults." "Well," Arivald sighed, "accept my apologies. On closer inspection, I can see you have a certain charm." "Aha, a primitive and vehement charm, they do say about me." "You've got an eye, wizard. I forgive you, and in turn admit that your nose surely speaks of a remarkable character." Arivald stroked his nose. "I've never thought of it that way," he said, "but maybe it is indeed a bit too big." "Nonsense!" Krulg protested. "Rather, it's noble and distinguished." "You know," Arivald said, "you seem like a very pleasant being, and clearly a connoisseur of human physiognomy. I'm glad we could meet here thanks to Borandrin. I'm also pleased to meet someone with such refined aesthetic sensibilities. Not everyone could instantly recognize my wild and primitive allure." Arivald saw no reason to remind Krulg that it was Krulg himself who had used this description. "How can I assist you, wizard?" Krulg asked from the orb. "Just Arivald, if you please. I came simply to see who my friend has been meeting with. I admit, we suspected him of engaging in accidental necromancy." Krulg burst into loud laughter. "Do I look like someone from the other world? We also prohibit all forms of necromancy." "You look like raw beef," Arivald thought to himself somewhat maliciously, though he was now completely reassured. Krulg was neither dead nor undead, or, at least, he was exceptionally good at masking it. "I'm simply sharing with this little, sniffly wizard my vast knowledge of practical magic." "It's nice to have a student again," Krulg said. "Again?" Arivald asked very gently. Krulg hesitated, as much as one could read hesitation on his peculiar face. "I haven't been involved in teaching for some time," Krulg explained after a moment. "I've dedicated myself to research. But this change is refreshing." "So, you were a professor of magic in your land. By the way, where is this land?" Arivald asked. "It's hard to explain." Krulg rubbed his chin with his fingers. For the first time, Arivald noticed Krulg's hand. It had 3 fingers, each ending in a short, rounded nail of a brownish color. "There are always complications with these neighboring worlds," Krulg continued. "One could study it, but such research would require weeks of calculations by a team of specialists. However, I suspect we're in a neighboring world because, judging by your appearance, evolution has taken a completely different path. Worlds existing beside our own were classified as either parallel or alternate. Alternate worlds were simply versions of our world where certain events had unfolded differently. For instance, Arivald knew of a place where his counterpart was still a mercenary, even a captain in Prince Vesvera's guard. But he also knew of a world where he had died during the battle with the moribund elves in the Rotten Forest. Alternate worlds were meticulously studied by wizards specializing in history, but for the average person, they ceased to be interesting after the initial fascination. Neighboring worlds, however, presented a much more complex problem. Some theorized that these were worlds located on other planets, a bold concept put by Vigarius, known as the Unity Problem, while others believed they were the same Earth, but from a different dimension. Still, others called for a ban on any such contacts, labeling them as necromancy and its derivatives. Fortunately, they were now a minority, though an exceptionally aggressive one. Luckily, none of the members of the Wizards' Council belonged to this faction, and there was hope that the controversy would die down on its own. In any case, it was no surprise that locating a neighboring world posed a challenge for Krog's people. The Wizards of Silmanian also struggled with this issue. Arivald had hoped that Krog might know more, and the mention of a team of specialists offered a glimmer of possibility. It suggested that magic in Krog's world might be at a higher level, in this specialty at least. In Silmanian, even if the wizards worked for a year, they wouldn't be able to reach any concrete results because the necessary research tools simply didn't exist yet. "I was once a famous professor," Krog said with a certain nostalgia in his voice. "Students came to me from all over the world. People lined up at dawn for my lectures." "Impressive," Borandrin said with admiration. "I'm speaking with Arivald now, you sniffly wizard," Krog said loftily, "so I don't wish to hear anyone else's remarks or comments." Borandrin slumped and said nothing more. He glanced at Arivald with a look that was a mix of resentment and admiration. "So why did you give it up?" Arivald asked, intrigued. "Fame breeds enemies," Krog said sententiously. "Envy, pettiness, these flaws must exist in your world too. I was accused of heresy," he sighed, "but that was long ago." "And what did you do?" "Magic should serve development and evolution. In our world, it was an elite science. Magic to the masses, a wizard in every village, those were my slogans. I demanded change, intervention in nature. I was particularly focused on agricultural magic. I bred a vegetable that was half tomato, half potato. When I started altering and programming the climate, they came after me." "That's unfortunate," Arivald said, though he deduced that Krog must have caused quite a mess in his world. "Yes, unfortunate. But we prophets are never appreciated by the ignorant masses. We are the ones who burn at the stake, whose books are destroyed, whose names are erased from texts and encyclopedias." Krog looked upward with an inspired expression. "But our time will come," he thundered at last. "To be honest, in our world, a concept similar to yours is known as the heresy of Regardius," Arivald said. "And as far as I'm concerned, I don't see much sense in radical interventions in nature. Although, I must admit, potatomatos seem like a very interesting idea, provided, of course, that they were edible. Not only edible, delicious." Krog licked his lips with a long, snake-like tongue, which looked rather disgusting. "They practically melted in your mouth." The wizard stroked his beard. "We could try something like that, as a small experiment." "With pleasure," Krog exclaimed. "I'll teach you all the necessary formulas and spells. But those tomatoes are just a trifle. But you have to start somewhere." "Wait!" Arivald suddenly remembered something. "What did you need the Necromanticon for?" "Necromanticon?" Krog repeated with surprise. "I needed it," Borandrin dared to interject. "I remember having a book by Dwagus on using fertilizers that always lay next to a Necromanticon. If I can't find the Necromanticon, I can't find it either." "Fertilizers?" Arivald's eyes widened. "I traveled all this way just to find out that the Necromanticon wasn't needed for experiments." "That you were looking for some book on fertilizers? On cow manure? Who'd ever experiment with medlock?" Borandrin shrugged. "I've never even read that book." Arivald looked at him for a moment and then nodded. "And let's keep it that way," he finally said. He was simultaneously surprised, relieved, and moved by the encounter with a being from another world or dimension. He concluded that the orb was certainly one of Gorga's greatest discoveries. The contact was clear, prolonged, and uninterrupted by any unexpected events. Nothing like this had ever been achieved before. Usually, contact with other realms was limited to viewing selected fragments of space. This was entirely different. Moreover, Arivald was genuinely pleased that the suspicions about Borandrin had proven unfounded. Borandrin was still his slightly eccentric self but hadn't crossed any forbidden boundaries. Of course, Arivald should inform the Brotherhood about establishing contact and the extraordinary properties of the orb, but this was a minor offense. At least, minor compared to the suspicions of necromancy. Still, Borondrin would pay for his insubordination and keeping his discoveries secret. The Brotherhood always maintained that a wizard was obligated to share knowledge with others, or at least with the Council, and viewed any deviations from this rule unfavorably. Individualism, yes, but within reasonable limits, Master Harbulera often said, and he was right, as it was professional solidarity that constituted a large part of Brotherhood's power in Silmanian. "Let's get back to my tomatoes," Krolg reminded them. "Indeed," Arivald agreed. "Let's begin." Learning from a being from another dimension wasn't as simple as it might seem. The magical rules, concepts, and formulas were radically different in the two worlds. But Borondrin had already learned a lot during his meetings with Krolg, and now that knowledge came in handy. Arivald had to admit that learning was genuinely enjoyable. Krolg turned out to be an ideal teacher, calm, methodical, and humorous when necessary. The wizard couldn't help but marvel at how misleading first impressions could be. They spent long evenings with the Gorga's orb, and then, usually until dawn, they practiced new formulas and prepared the appropriate mixtures and ingredients. Cleaning, of course, went out the window because there was no time for it anymore, and Arivald only made sure to conjure at least 2 bowls of cream daily for Mazgilla. However, the cat was still furious, as no one had time to talk to him, and when he tried to start a pleasant conversation, he was impatiently shooed away. As a result, Mazgilla often muttered dark prophecies from the corner, saying, "You'll see, nothing good will come of this." At those times, Borondrin would usually throw a slipper at him, which did nothing to improve Mazgilla's mood. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of intensive preparation, the wizards were ready. They prepared the seedlings, performed the necessary rituals over them, and concocted a special set of fertilizers, using up such a quantity of precious ingredients that they could have probably bought a cartload of tomatoes for it. The seedlings were placed in a specially prepared greenhouse, and now they only had to wait. According to Krolg, the potato-tomato hybrid was supposed to mature 3 days after planting. "We'll go down in history." Borondrin rejoiced. Arivald was a bit more skeptical. "First of all, we don't know if it will be edible, and secondly, the cost of 1 plant is currently equivalent to a good horse." "And what about labor costs? Do you also believe, like Krolg, that the slogan "a wizard in every village" should be implemented? Who will prepare the soil and the seedlings?" "We're in the experimental phase," Borondrin grumbled, unhappy about being brought back down to earth. "What do you expect, everything at once?" During the 3 days they waited for the vegetables, they got back to cleaning, and this time even Borondrin showed some enthusiasm. They even managed to find Medlock's Necromanticon, though the fertilizer manual was still nowhere to be found, and with Borondrin's permission, Arivald packed it into his luggage to return the dangerous book to the Silmanian library. Finally, the long-awaited day arrived. They got up at dawn and rushed to the greenhouse without even eating breakfast. The plants looked magnificent. Large yellow, red, and green tomatoes hung from the branches. "Dig, let's see if there's a potato," Borondrin urged impatiently. Arivald plunged the spade into the soil. At that moment, the tomatoes screamed. Not out loud, but in the minds of Arivald and Borondrin. "Don't touch me," the message screamed through the noise. Then some incredible force struck Arivald's mind, and if Borondrin hadn't thrown up Paphnus's mental shield at that moment, showing that Borondrin, when it came down to it, was indeed a skilled wizard, Arivald would have certainly lost consciousness. Both of them fled from the greenhouse in panic. "What the hell?" Borondrin gasped, struggling to catch his breath. What power that had! Arivald wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at the tomato bushes, which now, from a distance, appeared perfectly normal. "That friend of yours has really done a number on us," he said. My friend, Borondrin, feeling offended, was about to argue but suddenly stopped. "All right, let's burn this abomination." "Damn, my greenhouse." "Ready?" "Ready." On cue, they drew their wands, executed a perfectly synchronized sequence of movements, recited the appropriate incantation, and stood in concentration for several minutes. Soon, the grass around the greenhouse ignited with a blue-pink flame. It was one of the simplest combat spells, the so-called Trebonius Firestarter, which Arivald had often used in the past to ignite wetwood. The spell was short-lived and only effective at close range, but it should have done the trick in this case. It should have, but it didn't. The fire simply extinguished before it reached the greenhouse. Damn, Arivald and Borondrin muttered simultaneously, sensing a distinct disturbance in the aura. The tomatoes had defended themselves and either knew how to use the aura or at least disrupt it. We need a word with Krolg, Arivald snarled angrily and stormed toward the house. Borondrin, filled with the worst of forebodings, trudged after him. Krolg appeared in the orb as usual after a brief moment. "And are they tasty?" he asked cheerfully. "Delicious," Arivald growled. "What have you gotten us into? These tomatoes are alive and can use magic." "What's going on? Again?" Krolg sighed. "I thought it would be different in your world. That's precisely why I had problems. My tomatoes multiplied, and it wasn't until the Battle of Winnies that they were finally defeated. I thought it might work in your world." "The battle?" Arivald asked in disbelief, while Borondrin just stared wide-eyed. "Oh, what a battle it was!" Krolg reminisced dreamily. The charge of the heavy cavalry was broken, the magical firestorm was dispersed, and only a meteor shower, summoned by 122 of the kingdom's most powerful wizards, brought us victory over those bloodthirsty tomatoes. "He must be joking," Arivald muttered to Borondrin, "but it's a very peculiar sense of humor." "What do we do with them?" he asked Krolg. "And seriously, there is a way, but you won't manage it alone. You need the great Krolg," Arivald groaned, "and his magical power. So, get me out of here, and I'll help you." "Get you out?" Krolg moved away from his orb, and the wizard saw that the room he was in was a small cell. They clearly saw barred windows and solid iron doors. Krolg himself turned out to be a lizard-like creature with a long tail and a spiked crest on his back. 130 years of imprisonment, Krolg sighed, and only 17 have passed. That's how prophets are rewarded in my world. "Well, that's just great," Borondrin gasped. "Turns out we've been associating with a criminal. I'm feeling sick. My God, my blood pressure is rising again. I think I need to lie down." "Quiet!" Arivald barked, genuinely angry. "We'll handle this without you, you scoundrel," he snapped at Krolg. "I don't believe that some damn tomatoes can defend themselves against advanced magic." "Worth a try," Krolg agreed nonchalantly, unfazed by the insult. "But hurry, because they multiply incredibly fast." "What do you mean by incredibly fast?" Arivald asked, frowning. "Well, by tomorrow there'll be 5 to 6 times as many. Maybe 6 to 7, I can't remember. Anyway, a lot. They'll start crawling out soon." "Oh dear." Borondrin clutched his chest. "No need to worry," Arivald reassured him. "We'll prepare the Fire Ace Great Fire this afternoon, and that will be the end." The Great Fire was a truly powerful spell, with a complex code and a difficult-to-break structure. It required several hours of solid work, but the results were usually very satisfactory. Firace Longer developed it hundreds of years ago, and despite its age, the spell still enjoyed great respect. Besides, Firace also created several other extremely useful spells, among which the Firace's Barrier stood out. It could be used in combination with the Great Fire, ensuring that the wizard wouldn't be caught in the effects of the fire. "I wouldn't recommend it," Krolg murmured. "They have a strong reflection. You might get hit by your own spell, or the fire could be redirected elsewhere. I'm telling you, you need a specialist." Arivald gritted his teeth. Either this was true, or it was another trick. But if these strange plants could indeed reflect magic, the results of the Great Fire could be disastrous, which could as well apply to most other spells. Developing the appropriate neutralization for the reflection could take several days. "What audacity!" Borondrin exploded. "I thought you were a scholar, not a common blackmailer." "You go all out too if it meant not spending 130 years in a cell," Krolg replied without any anger. "You've gotten yourselves into trouble," Mazgilla meowed from under the desk. "I warned you, didn't I? As if I needed you to remind me." Borondrin shouted. "Get out of here." Mazgilla chuckled hoarsely and retreated deeper under the desk. "What should we do?" Arivald asked grimly. I'll pull one of you over to my side, and then everything will settle down." "What does that mean?" "You'll see," Krulg replied mysteriously. "Maybe we should try it ourselves?" Borondrin suggested. "After all, we're some of the best wizards in the world." Arivald preferred not to dwell on that topic. He had a very clear opinion of his own abilities, though he didn't intend to share it with anyone. "Maybe the best," Borondrin added after a moment's thought. "After all, we dealt with the Striegers, and here we are, dealing with tomatoes." He pronounced the word tomatoes with a tone that made it sound particularly obscene. "We managed, perhaps we managed." "You mostly had the hiccups," Arivald corrected him. "And what's to stop you from deceiving us again?" he directed at Krulg. "I want to get out of here." "So, which one of you is coming?" "Sink or swim," Arivald sighed. "What do I need to do?" "Think it over," Borondrin said, very concerned, though he felt a certain relief that he wouldn't be participating in this distasteful experiment himself. Though theoretically it should be him, considering whose fault the whole affair was. "Just think about wanting to be here." "I'll take care of the rest," Krulg said. Arivald placed his hands on the orb. It felt oddly warm and damp, and closed his eyes. He imagined himself entering the orb, passing through it, and emerging in the foreign world. Suddenly, he felt as if someone yanked his hair, painfully so. And then he was in Krulg's cell. "Complete success!" Krulg exclaimed in delight. "I haven't lost my touch." Arivald coughed, as the air here was slightly different, like breathing near a campfire, filled with smoke and heat. It could become quite unpleasant over time. Moreover, the world of Krulg was definitely warmer, as if standing close to a roaring fire. "And now?" the wizard asked, trying to breathe carefully and take shallow breaths. Krulg didn't answer. Instead, he slid toward the door. Given his anatomical structure, slid was more appropriate than walked, and knocked on it with his fist. After a moment, they heard footsteps, the sound of locks being opened, and then someone much larger than Krulg appeared at the door. This creature was dressed in something resembling chainmail and held a very menacing-looking weapon that resembled a forked scythe. Upon seeing Arivald, the creature gasped in surprise and immediately slammed the door shut. Then they heard the creature's footsteps echoing down the corridor, only now it was running. "It's begun," Krulg said, delighted. Arivald sat on an uncomfortable stool, uncomfortable because it was designed for Krulg's body, and resolved to remain calm no matter what. They didn't have to wait long. After a few minutes, the door opened again, and two lizard-like beings entered the cell. Unlike Krulg, their faces were more brown than red. Arivald guessed they might simply be older. One spoke quickly in a hissing language, and Krulg responded just as quickly. "My name is Haya," said the lizard-like being in the same dialect that Borondrin used to communicate with Krulg, "and I am one of the archmages of Rai Halli, and this is my secretary, Durangolg. We know where you come from, and we deeply sympathize with you for being deceived by this criminal. If there is any way we can help you, we will." Arivald couldn't suppress a sigh of relief. He quickly explained the entire situation in a few sentences. "You cursed monster!" Haya snapped, glaring contemptuously at Krulg. "Wasn't the trouble you caused here enough for you, that you now seek to meddle in another world? Wasn't the war with the cow-sheep enough for you?" He then explained to Arivald, he once created creatures that were supposed to produce cow's milk and meat while also growing sheep's wool. They were supposed to multiply like rabbits and eat only slightly more. But they had the same traits as your tomatoes. It took us 2 years to eradicate them. Good thing we only tried with tomatoes. Arivald swallowed hard. "What's the solution for the tomatoes?" "Only this criminal knows it," growled the archmage. "It's his recipe." "What do you want, you fiend, to get rid of this problem?" "They keep calling me a monster," Krulg complained, "but do I do this intentionally to harm anyone? I thought that in a different world, their bad traits would disappear. Sometimes stupidity is worse than malice." Haya slammed his fist on the table, and his tail whipped dangerously through the air. "Why didn't we have you executed?" "I think that's a moot point now," Krulg replied smoothly. "Let's get down to business. Here are my demands." Hearing this, Haya hissed sharply, and Krulg paled, his face turning from red to a lighter pink. I want asylum in their world, Krolg said in a conciliatory tone, a guarantee that no one will pursue me, and the right to conduct teaching. Nonsense, the Archmage hissed, snapping his tail against the floor. At this signal, a guard entered the cell. Take him away. As Krolg was led out, the Archmage turned to Arivald. You must choose. We can try to help you, but I doubt we'll quickly find the right way to eliminate those plants. And they will spread at a terrifying rate. If you decide to accept Krolg's help, you must keep your promises. He is an excellent mage, and even if you kill him, he will manage to cast a curse that could cause you more harm than these tomatoes. But be careful, the old lizard shook his head, he is very persuasive in spreading his ideas. He will infect those you assign to him as students, teach them very advanced magic, and turn your country into an experimental field. I don't know what advice to give you. I wouldn't hesitate to force the secret out of him through torture, but for many reasons that I can't discuss here, that might only bring harm to us all. Arivald had a vivid imagination, so he could easily envision a world filled with people who thought like Krolg. The idea of living in such a world didn't appeal to him at all. I won't deny we would gladly get rid of him, the Archmage continued. We'll issue a death sentence on him and announce he escaped, so that he never dares to return. Besides, you can destroy the orb that summoned him, and any others like it. Such orbs should be quite rare in your world. I know of two, Arivald said. Returning you to your world will be a bit more difficult. We'll have to enlist the help of other mags. Normally, we never do this. One of our laws strictly prohibits interference in the affairs of neighboring worlds. But as you can see, there are exceptions, he added with something like a sigh. I suppose I have no choice but to agree to Krolg's terms, Arivald said after a moment. But I think we should draft a strict and precise contract. Oh, certainly. But don't fool yourself into thinking he'll give up his right to teach in your world. It's his obsession. Infecting others with his twisted ideas. Arivald wasn't thrilled to be making a decision that could affect the fate of an entire world. But the worst remedy for problems is to bury your head in the sand. The mistake had already been made, and now the only thing left to do was to minimize the damage. Krolg needed to be reined in, but in a way that he wouldn't realize it was happening. All the while, Arivald couldn't shake the thought of trying to fight this plague unleashed by Krolg on his own. But he had a rather poor opinion of his magical abilities, and he only valued Borandrin as a theorist. Neither of them was suited to battling magical tomatoes. If Galadrin or Velvelvenal were here, not to mention Rector Lineal or the Grandmaster himself, then they might have tried. As it stood, negotiating with Krolg seemed the only option. Bring him in, higher ordered. Well? Krolg asked as soon as he entered. You're allowed to transfer to their world, the Archmage said, but we're issuing a death sentence on you here. Return, and you'll die. I agree, Krolg replied. It's a bit cold there, but I'll get used to it. What are your conditions? The Archmage asked Arivald. Your arrival, Arivald said, must not disrupt the functioning of our academy. We'll allow you to teach magic and your doctrines, but you will receive a group of students elected by the Brotherhood. Until you've passed on everything you know to them, you won't be allowed to take on more students. You'll probably give me those who need to be whipped into learning. I assure you, it will be quite the opposite, Arivald interjected. They will be eager to learn everything from you. But I don't mind that, Krolg continued. I can motivate even someone who's never heard of magic or despises it. I agree. And, of course, you will eliminate those cursed tomatoes you helped us create. Moreover, you will not create any new beings, plants, fruits, or animals, and you won't conduct any experiments without the Council of Wizards' approval. If you break the terms of the contract, we'll either force you to return or eliminate you. Also, know that any curse you cast upon your death won't work if we act in accordance with the contract. And if they send you back, we'll be waiting here for you, added the Archmage. No problem, Krolg seemed slightly amused. That's it, said Arivald. That's it? The Archmage looked closely at Arivald. I hope you know what you're doing. My secretary will draft the contract. Drafting the contract, in 3 languages, clarifying certain lexical ambiguities, and agreeing on the nuances took several hours. Finally, the agreement was signed and sworn. Krulg, pleased with himself, tapped his tail on the floor. Arivald, sweaty and with skin dry as parchment, the climate here was truly dreadful, was only waiting for it all to end. "I can't wait," Krulg said, as if verbalizing Arivald's thoughts. The wizard was sure that Krulg had expected harsher conditions. He was well aware that the lizard-like mage didn't care at all about the prohibition on conducting experiments. He knew that his new students would eagerly take that up instead. And there was no clause in the contract forbidding the students from experimenting. Even if such a clause had been included, Krulg wouldn't have signed, arguing, quite rightly, that he couldn't make commitments on behalf of someone else, especially when he didn't know who that someone would be. Finally, the documents were signed with ornate signatures. Krulg's signature featured an elaborate flourish. The Archmage extended a finger, poking it into Krulg's chest. Arivald somehow knew that this was an exceptionally insulting gesture. "Remember," Haya said, and he must have supported his words with a particularly strong spell because the atmosphere thickened noticeably, and Krulg looked like he couldn't even move. "Never come back here." The Archmage lowered his hand and looked at Arivald. "Now we'll try to send you back. It might not be very pleasant." "Life is generally unpleasant," the wizard quipped, trying to sound humorous, even though in fact he wasn't in the mood for jokes. The operation to send them back took nearly 7 hours, and in the final stages, 33 lizard mags had to be involved. That number had some hidden significance in their world. During those 7 hours, Arivald felt, first, a constant sense of nausea, and second, pain in the roots of his hair, as if someone was yanking it very hard at regular intervals. But the worst was the unbearable itching in a place where such itching usually indicates a nasty disease, characteristic of people who haven't been too cautious with their life's pleasures. Additional attractions included the continuous, monotonous incantations of the lizard mags spoken in their hissing language and the thick, brownish-grey smoke from particularly foul-smelling incense. And suddenly, as the 7th hour of these torments was coming to an end, Arivald felt as if the one who had been pulling his hair had grown tired of the game and decided to rip it out by the roots. He barely managed to stifle a groan, but his eyes filled with tears, and he sneezed violently. When he opened his eyes again, he was sitting on the carpet in Borandrin's room, and next to him, Krulg was sprawled out, looking quite deflated. Borandrin was sitting in an armchair, opposite the orb glowing with a scarlet light, his head drooping on his shoulder, snoring softly. Arivald had a strong urge to whack him on the head but managed to restrain his violent instincts. "Sea cold," Krulg stammered, wrapping his tail around the carpet. "Serves you right," Arivald replied mercilessly. "Get up." He shook his companion by the shoulder, not even trying to be delicate. Borandrin jolted awake with a wild look in his eyes, but quickly muttered Gordamius' third post-sleep and came to his senses instantly. "What a nightmare I had," he exclaimed, just as he turned to see Krulg rising from the carpet and beginning to look around the room. Borandrin groaned. "A nightmare," Arivald echoed sarcastically. "Maybe I should pinch you?" They were silent for a moment, with Borandrin avoiding eye contact. "You," Arivald directed his gaze at Krulg, "take care of those cursed plants before it's too late." "I want a coat," demanded the lizard-like mage gloomily. In Borandrin's vast wardrobe, they managed to find an enormous coat with a fur collar, slightly moth-eaten, a fur hat with ear flaps, which only fit on the top of Krulg's head, and a camel-wool scarf with patterns of palms and pyramids. Krulg bundled himself up and tried a few times to cast a spell, but it didn't seem to come out correctly. "I can't breathe," he finally complained. "My throat's scratching from the cold." "Tomatoes." Arivald reminded him, suddenly fearful that Krulg's methods might not work here. That would be a catastrophe. "Do you have a bathtub, snotty wizard?" Krulg asked. Borandrin nodded grimly. "And salt?" Borandrin nodded again. "Fill the tub and pour in a bucket of salt," Krulg ordered. "And don't sneeze on me," he shouted, as Borandrin, sneezing, did not cover his face. "I have no desire to catch one of your diseases." "Manners!" Arivald hissed, surprised that Borandrin shuffled obediently toward the door. But Borandrin had had enough of being treated dismissively, called a snotty wizard, and being ordered around in his own home. He opened the door, and through it, a massive cast-iron bathtub flew in and slammed down at Krulg's feet. The mage from another world jumped back, trying to cast some sort of protective spell, but failed again. A moment later, a bucket full of salt majestically floated in and dumped its contents right over his head. Arivald inwardly admired Borandrin's spell-casting prowess. He must have been truly furious for everything to be working so flawlessly. Krulg, however, refrained from expressing any admiration. Borandrin calmly shut the door, walked over to the bucket, and with a spell, gathered the salt from the floor, then poured it back into the bucket. What next? He asked coolly, and Arivald was reminded of the fearless wizard whose hiccups once drove the Streegers of Shaven Forest into the deepest holes. Pour the salt into the water and stir, Krulg said in a hesitant tone. And then? Pour the solution over the tomatoes, Krulg replied. And that's it. They'll wither. Damn swindler! Borandrin roared. We would have figured that out ourselves. But how long would it take? Krulg asked maliciously. How many battle spells would you have cast? And do you know how fast they reproduce? He attempted to settle into a chair, eventually succeeding after a brief skirmish with the stubborn piece of furniture. I would have revealed this method to you anyway. I rarely make mistakes, but I never hesitate to correct them. I wouldn't have exposed you to a war with tomatoes. How considerate of you, Arivald muttered, though surprisingly, he found himself believing Krulg. Suddenly, the plan he had devised to neutralize Krulg seemed excessively harsh. But on the other hand, who knew how many more mistakes Krulg might make and whether he could rectify them as easily as he had this time? Dealing with the tomato problem took only a few minutes. The tomatoes first tried to destroy the incoming bathtub with a concentrated mental attack, then struck with a reflection spell. But since the bathtub had no mind and wasn't a spell itself, it was completely unaffected. It calmly spilled the salted water over the tomatoes, which shrieked and attempted to flee. But before they could slither away, the withering process began. The wizards heard the tomatoes' screams gradually fade until they were silenced forever. They breathed a sigh of relief. The fight wasn't won without some losses. The tomatoes had destroyed Borandrin's greenhouse, eaten all the young cauliflowers, and gnawed on a year-old orange tree. But such losses were easy to fix. Time to settle the debt, Krulg cheerfully observed, having learned to create a warm microclimate around himself, allowing him to shed the coat, scarf, and hat in favor of a better mood. Indeed, Arivald replied seriously. We need to head to Silmanian. The Grandmaster will issue you a license to teach. Now that's something I like, Krulg said, sweeping his tail in excitement, nearly knocking Borandrin off his feet. They departed the next day. Borandrin bid farewell to Arivald with a certain sense of relief, as he felt guilty about the entire fiasco, and Arivald's presence served as a constant reminder of that guilt. Moreover, Borandrin genuinely wanted to rest after the nerve-wracking events, knowing that they would haunt his dreams for a long time. At the same time, he was angry with himself for feeling relieved at Arivald's departure, recognizing his own ingratitude, which in turn triggered more guilt. It was a vicious cycle. Mazgila was genuinely displeased with Arivald's departure, even though the wizard had left a clever, well-coded spell in Borandrin's house that would emit a piercing meow to remind him to conjure a daily bowl of cream. Arivald was confident that Borandrin would prefer to summon the treat rather than attempt to decode the spell or endure a day of incessant meowing. Mazgila, in a dignified manner, thanked Arivald, though his eyes gleamed with indecent greed. I was just a bystander in all this, the cat complained to the wizard as he was about to leave. I was merely a humorous prop in the whole story. Yet I could have been an evil wizard trapped in a cat's body, responsible for all this chaos. Arivald laughed heartily. It's better to be a decent cat than an indecent wizard, he said. At least, that's how I see it. Yes, Mazgila muttered, unconvinced, but what if I'm a great wizard who was turned into a cat and lost his memory? I've never heard of such a case, replied Arivald, amused. Well, you wizards, Mazgila scratched behind his ear. Stop by again sometime. Keep an eye on Borandrin, Arivald requested, waving to the cat before climbing into the saddle. Until we meet again. The journey with Krulg was far from pleasant, as the lizard-like mage constantly complained about the weather, having to walk, no horse let him ride it, the poor quality of the inns and the food, and the unhealthy curiosity he aroused among the common folk. Arivald had given up trying to explain to Krulg that he had told people the lizard-like creature was a new exhibit for the Silmanian Zoo. He wisely considered that Krulg wouldn't appreciate that explanation. News of the strange creature being escorted by a Silmanian mage reached the Brotherhood even before Arivald's arrival. Knowing his eccentricities, the mags there were mildly concerned. Arivald immediately requested an audience with Harbulera and briefly explained the entire situation. "What have you done?" The Grand Master was genuinely horrified. "This contract is a disaster. We'll assign him specially untalented students," Arivald said. "There aren't students untalented enough that a good mage can't teach at least the basics. And that's not even the worst." "What have you done?" he repeated. He poured himself a glass of wine. As usual, it was some old, vile swill, but sold at the price of gold. "I took the liberty of inviting a guest on your behalf," Arivald said. "What guest?" Harbulera asked, staring blankly at the wall. He was pondering both what to do with Krulg and what to do with Arivald. Arivald clapped his hands, and a servant entered the room. "Bring in Dundin," he said. A moment later, a burly dwarf with a silver beard, braided into two plaits tucked into his belt, entered the room. His thick mane, dyed with walnut dye, was pulled back into a ponytail. He wore a simple leather tunic, but his fingers gleamed with gold rings set with exceptionally large rubies. A thick gold chain hung from his chest, with links so massive it was a wonder how the dwarf managed to carry it. This was Dundin Wrymouth, a nickname he earned after the Battle of Hurldin, where a kobold's gizarm had split his lip and cheek, a trader and smuggler, the unofficial leader of all Silmanian dwarfs, whose opinion was respected, or even admired, even among the clans. "Greetings, Master Wizard," Dundin nodded slightly to Harbulera, then turned to Arivald. "And to you, Master Wizard," he added. "Perhaps some wine?" Arivald offered. Dundin glanced at the decanter. "I think I'll pass," he replied politely. Dwarfs, too, were familiar with the unmatched qualities of Harbulera's wine, which was infamous for its poor taste despite its exorbitant price. On the other hand, Arivald's wine, a decent beverage made from grapes, oranges, lemons, and quince juice, which never aged longer than a year, was something dwarfs genuinely enjoyed. "Please, have a seat." Arivald gestured to a chair. "We've been deliberating for a long time, thinking about how the world is arranged that such a noble race as yours, Dundin, has yet to harness magical powers." It was rare to surprise a dwarf, but Arivald had managed to do so. From a distant world, Arivald waved his hands to emphasize just how far away this world was. "We've brought the greatest wizard. And now I want to ask, Dundin, if you would do us the honor of selecting dwarfs who might learn magic. Think about it, the time may come when we need elite warriors who can wield magic. And who is a better warrior than a dwarf? Who is braver and stronger? With power, you would be the defenders of our world." Dundin looked at the wizard with wide eyes, then turned his gaze to Harbulera, as if to say, has he gone mad, or will you explain what's going on? Yes, the Grandmaster interjected. "It's an excellent, outstanding idea, one we've been contemplating recently." Dundin still sat in stunned silence, but even in his astonishment, he was already considering how to turn this proposal to his advantage. Dwarfs had a knack for this. Even if offered a sack of gold, they would ask how much more they'd get for accepting it. Learning magic was a wild, never fulfilled, and carefully hidden dream of every dwarf, though publicly, dwarfs spoke of it with a hint of irony, treating wizards as equals at most. "We have a lot of work, and we need many hands," Dundin began to grumble. "I'm not sure if anything can be done. I'll send a message to my kin in the mountains, perhaps they can find one or two willing, but don't get your hopes up." "Well, that's unfortunate," Arivald replied. "It's even more disappointing because I understand you won't have miners for our new mine in Soitek either." "What a shame, as we were planning to lease it to you." "We've already drafted a preliminary agreement with Ragnar Pickaxe," Harbulera lied smoothly. "With Ragnar," the dwarf nearly shouted. "That scoundrel? He doesn't even know how to dig a proper tunnel." Ragnar Pickaxe was a human and the main shareholder or lessee of several mines, and one of the dwarf's most formidable competitors. Yes, well, Arivald stood up, signaling to Dundin that the audience was over. "I've come across an idea," Dundin quickly said. "To encourage my kin to study this difficult and thankless field, which is magic, I will set a good example and attend the first few lessons myself." He puffed out his chest proudly. "Well, perhaps. We'll think it over, but we wouldn't want to interfere with your other urgent duties." Arivald remained standing, and Dundin nervously twisted the rings on his fingers, torn between the etiquette that suggested he should leave and the fear of missing such an opportunity, which urged him to stay. "We'll, of course, cover the costs of maintenance and preparations," Dundin stated, making Harbulera momentarily think he had misheard. Him and Arivald put on a bored expression. "Deal, Master Wizard?" The dwarf extended his muscular arm. 30 students, Arivald replied. "You pay the wages, prepare the school, and so on." "Agreed?" "Agreed," Dundin replied, looking as if he had just been swindled. Krulg inspected the school built by the dwarfs, which was not a formal branch of the Silmanian Academy, but rather a somewhat unofficial entity. He grumbled a bit, though with a sly and cunning expression, but his mood brightened when he saw the students. Never in his long career had he encountered individuals so eager for knowledge, so passionate about their work, and willing to dedicate every moment to it, even at the expense of sleep and mealtime. He was thrilled and had high hopes. "We'll conquer the world, boys," he said, and the dwarfs were nodding seriously in agreement, their beards swaying. Galandrin, commonly nicknamed Damsel, arrived in Silmanian on a drizzly and windy evening. As the mage living closest to the Dwarven School of Magic, he had been assigned the responsibility of discreetly overseeing Krulg and his students. Arivald, already aware of Galadrin's arrival, was waiting with a substantial jug of orange wine, hoping that he hadn't caught Galadrin during one of his frequent, though short-lived, periods of abstinence. Arivald was a bit anxious, though the fact that Galadrin was only arriving after half a year suggested that nothing too dire had occurred. Yet, deep down, a sense of unease remained, and Arivald kept doubting himself what could happen if his plan backfired. "Dear Arivald," Galadrin called out as he burst into the mage's room. His cloak was wet and mud-stained, since, as usual, he didn't lower himself to using a carriage and had traveled the entire way on horseback. "Welcome, damsel." Arivald warmly embraced Galadrin, with whom he had shared a deep friendship for many years. "Wine!" Galadrin exclaimed in delight, and as Arivald heard the loud gulping as Damsel tipped the jug to his lips, he was certain that the evening was going to be a merry one. Unless not, of course. "So, what?" Arivald asked, unable to muster the patience to move to the main topic more gradually. "What, about what?" Galadrin squinted. "Don't play games, just tell me." Our freakish friend." "Do you know what Lee said when she saw him?" Lee was Galadrin's wife. Damsel was one of the few exceptions among wizards in this regard, who initially seemed like a sensible girl but later allowed herself to be converted to vegetarianism. Arivald always repeated that there was something of a mental illness in vegetarianism. Of course, he never said this to Lee, because he liked her very much and knew that it would cause her great distress. Arivald had always been Lee's greatest hero, ever since he had saved her family from the clutches of the weirdo of the Weirdo's Forest. Whenever magic or wizards were discussed, Lee would recount the story of Arivald, who had defeated the evil weirdo after first dealing with his bloodthirsty dragon. This sometimes irritated Galadrin, but he had enough of a sense of humor, and liked Arivald enough, to even embellish these stories himself. "Maybe you could tell me your wife's opinion later," Arivald suggested. "The news isn't cheerful," Galadrin said, his tone suddenly serious. Arivald felt a cold stab of fear in his chest. "No," he gasped in disbelief. "Krulg has taught them a lot," Galadrin said as he finally unbuttoned his cloak. As usual, he wore one of his satin shirts beneath it, with an elegant dagger with a gold hilt at his waist. He always took care to look his best. "It's happened, then," Arivald whispered. "It has," Galadrin echoed in a hollow voice. "What we feared has come to pass." Tyrian's third treatise goes to trash. The third treatise of Tyrian, subtitled On Dwarfs, was the most comprehensive compendium of knowledge about the dwarven race. The first covered elves, and the second, humans. Tyrion had intended to write a fourth on kobolds, but before he could, the kobolds ate him. This was why the fourth treatise was rightly called unfinished. Later works, such as The Mountain Tribes by Shalog or The People of Phineas Mountains, not to mention the apocryphal novel Dwarven Milk by Andreas Puffer, didn't come close to covering the subject in full. Tyrion had performed an extensive analysis of the Dwarven language and customs, and in the 7th chapter, he had proven, using very complex formulas, that no dwarf could master even the simplest magic. Tyrion was widely trusted because he was a scientist full of passion and good intentions. Although the dwarfs accused him of having such a great love of knowledge that he had performed several vivisections, this was generally considered slander. In any case, the Silmanian Academy displayed a striking painting by Turnus titled Martyr for Knowledge, which depicted Tyrion in a cauldron of boiling water, surrounded by vegetables. Tyrion leaned over the edge of the cauldron, while a kobold greedily gnawed on his hand. The painting was blatantly false. Kobolds never ate humans other than raw, so they had no reason to cook him in a cauldron, but it had nevertheless brought the artist great popularity. And now, Krulg through practical activities had revoked the theses of the immortal Tyrion. What would the world become with dwarfs who had mastered the basics of magic? It was simply unimaginable. And knowing the dwarfs, it could also become unbearable. What will happen to our world? Arivald asked, feeling a bit helpless and, for the first time in many years, very, very old. Indeed, Galadrin lowered his head. What have they learned? I was waiting for that question, Galadrin replied in a voice as grim as the scrape of a gravedigger's shovel against the edge of a tomb. He lifted his head and snapped his fingers. From between his fingers emerged a small, cold flame. It was the famous glowworm of Parvus. It gave off about as much light as a candle with a short wick. The spell was famous because Parvus, after being struck on the head by a goblin's club, forgot all the spells he knew except for this one. And yet, or perhaps because of it, he led Prince Samwell's troops out of the Thurlong marshes. The spell was also famous because it was the first magical trick that the youngest, 4-year-old, students at the academy learned. Memorizing it took the slowest learners about 2 hours. Galadrin, I'm going to kill you. Arivald shouted, feeling a weight lift from his heart. Damsel laughed loudly. 6 months of learning to master Parvus. Can you imagine? When will they learn ignition or divine radiance? In 5 years, 10? Better ask how long Krulg will live, Arivald replied. Who knows, maybe in 100, 200 years, he'll teach them enough that they'll know as much as 6-year-olds. Galadrin finished, then lifted the jug of orange wine. To the dwarfs, Arivald, he said in a solemn tone. To the dwarfs.